we found like actual camps of the workers that have built the pyramid. So like we get that time period completely calibrated, and you see the camps of the workers, what they ate, what they did. We find their toolkits. People that sell tours to like the Inca tours and like some other places, they will flat out say like the reason I discovered this was because I just couldn't believe like the ancient Inca could build something like this. And it's
Wow.
like it would come to fist fights, like near fist fights. My advisor like would like hit his hand on the table. Like one time I saw him yelling at each other. And with archaeology, I think there's a misconception that we find one thing and we make up these like big stories about it. And sometimes that's true with some archaeologists that might not be very good at their job, but
Welcome to the inaugural podcast show, which is still untitled. That's how new we are. Today, I have none other than my own sister. You know what they say, leverage your own family first, get ahead, and then you can move on from there. But that doesn't take away from the fact that I have one of not just the smartest people I know, one of the smartest people, period, that just exists. um you're going to come to find out in this podcast how insightful and how knowledgeable she really is. And she's my sister, like I said, Justine Issavi. Dr. Justine Issavi, let me correct myself. uh Justine, welcome to the show. Please give me a quick and easy intro about who you are and what you do.
thank you, man. Way to set up expectations. Hope I can live up to them for this. I'm excited to be your first guest.
There will be a lot of gnashing of the teeth during this episode.
The editing should be funny at least.
At
So,
least,
yeah.
yes.
Well, okay, so thank you for having me. My name is Justine. Great introduction, by the way. I want you to be my hype man always. I am a research lead right now at an optical company. That's what I do for my day job. But in a past life, I had a much more exciting career as an archaeologist. That's what I did my doctoral research in. And so for most of my adult life, I was an archaeologist and lived and breathed and did all of those things.
Okay. Since I have no podcast decorum, we'll just get right into the questions. The first question I have is like looking back. I know in my own perspective, I can pinpoint it, but can you pinpoint at what age or what a certain moment of time you found yourself curious with human interaction, humanity, alive, dead, it just that kind of a deal?
So my initial interest in archaeology, I can definitely pinpoint it to a couple of things. One is that I was always curious about who we were, who we are, what our story is overall, like both as our ethnicity for Assyrians, like we grew up in Iran, but we were an ethnic minority. So
Mhm.
I remember like the first day of school, I was meeting friends and they're like, "Where are you from?" And I was like, "I don't know." Here.
Yeah.
And so for me, it was a big question of like, where are we from? And I have no idea. And so I remember reading the history books in school in Iran, and the one description of Assyrians that I remember very, very vividly was the Assyrians were bloodthirsty people, like fierce warriors, and like, and I was just thinking, okay, surely like the story can be told in a better way, even at that age. I'm not necessarily thinking anything of it, but just the desire to read a better story and not necessarily to know where that is going to come from. So that created a curiosity in me. And then I think what really, really solidified it is, do you remember our trip to Persepolis with mom and dad?
Yes, I
We
think about it
took
all
the
the
road trip.
time, all the
That
time.
was it. And it wasn't like so we went to Persepolis. It was a day trip, incredible, like full of awe, just these big, massive structures. What really did it for me, though, I remember when we went into the museum, there was this little case and it had a piece of curtain that was burned from the time that Alexander the Great had like raised the palace,
Wow, I
essentially.
don't remember that.
And I just remember thinking, wow, like this is like that one moment in time from thousands of years ago, and I'm like standing here looking at it.
Wow.
And that was super cool. And I
That
think like that's still my favorite thing about archaeology is like when you uncover something and you think about like the person, the thing that caused it to be there, how long it's been since another human's seen it. It's really, really cool.
Wow, that's awesome. I didn't know about that. I don't remember that part about the Alexander the Great. I just remember the trip as a whole. We're on our way to Bandar Abbas, and it was a very eventful trip to say the least. But that's for another episode.
Mhm.
How did like you said, we're from Iran, and how did like our immigration affect, and more importantly, like our travels? Like we went through a lot of countries, we saw a lot of cultures which were completely different from each other. How did that affect you, the way you process things, the way you look at different cultures, different pieces of history? How did that affect you?
I think the main thing it did for me was it made it easier to accept and just easily understand, and it like it's second nature to me that different people do things differently,
Hmm.
and it's not just they eat different or they sleep different. It's like the entire worldview is different.
Right.
Their reality is almost different to that point. And so it's a I think once you accept that, it becomes a lot easier for you to try as much as you can to suspend your own bias system of beliefs so that when you're doing research about something that might be completely foreign or different from you, like it's just it made it easier to accept because from a young age, like you said, we experienced different cultures, different places. It wasn't that one thing was good or bad. It was just things were different. And so
Hmm.
it just helps me, I guess, be in that mindset a lot more. Yeah, I think that that would be the main effect it had. Now, if you ask me about the trauma we endured, that's a different story, career wise.
That's another episode with a therapist on hand. So we'll schedule that as soon as possible.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I agree completely. I started to try to learn Mandarin, which is very difficult, by the way.
Mhm.
I tried to find streamers, different kind of like Chinese streamers that speak Mandarin, and even though it's really difficult keeping up, and the translations are horrendous sometimes. I mean, it doesn't even make sense because the slang is so, it's a different world. I
Mhm.
agree. It is a completely different world. Do you think someone who hasn't traveled as much is handicapped in your field?
No, absolutely not. I think what you really need to have is a sense of curiosity about people and an open mind about what it is that you're looking into. I think as long as you're curious, you're gonna wanna understand or try to understand because I think whatever is different, unknown at the time, maybe a little bit off-putting to you, or maybe you might not understand it, and you might be moved to judge it, but I think just being curious helps you be more open to understanding where something is coming from, why something is the way it is, why people do something.
I agree. Do you think the internet helps, or VR? MetaQuest is, I mean, it's huge now. I've never tried it, but it seems like it would be really helpful in seeing these historical monuments and places and all of these things. Do you think that helps or would help?
Oh yeah, totally. I think even so, I'm gonna age myself, but some of the first projects that I did in archaeology, I actually was not present there. So the team that I was working
Oh,
with actually went to Xi'an in China and they laser scanned a bunch of imperial tombs. And so one of the first projects that I ever did was create a 3D model based on those laser scans so that we could create an immersive experience.
wow.
So these tombs that were super restricted in Xi'an, maybe, I don't know, a handful of officials and this research team had been allowed inside, are now like available in 3D as an immersive experience.
Oh,
So,
wow. That's
and that was in 2011. So you can imagine that now with everything as easy as it is,
mm-hmm.
in terms of just the technology itself, how high quality it is, how much more powerful our computers are. I remember we used to have to carry these gigantic monsters of a laptop. And massive laser scanners. You couldn't have any light leak through for them to capture things, and now your iPhone could be just as powerful, and it's hard to believe, but
Yeah, I agree.
hugely important. Yeah.
Yeah, well, 谢谢 for that. Um, uh, okay, so this is my own personal question. Can you just go somewhere, and let's say you own the land, there's like a not a zoning issue. Can you just start digging just willy-nilly? Can you just get right into it? Or even if you don't own the land, can you go to a public land and just get right in?
So no is the short answer. I think most places now have very specific regulations for cultural heritage. In the United States, that's complicated because private property laws, I think, have given landowners a few, like some more rights than that sort of allow some kind of prospecting within your own lands.
Mm-hmm.
Is it ethical and is it a good way of finding things? Absolutely not. I think even I will say though in the past and how archaeology started as a discipline,
Mm-hmm.
there were more instances of people, just if you have the resources, you might go to another country or even in your own country within your own estate and just start a dig because you've either suspected something, you see something, you've read something.
Not a lot of permits back in the day.
No, no, but I will say even back then, the thing is that with digging somewhere, digging is hard work, and so it's expensive work often. And so even in places or in times when there wasn't that much regulation, you would want to do a calculated risk of where you want to dig because no one's resources are infinite. And so you would want to do some historical research, right? So you would, like, for example, the very famous example of Schliemann, like unethical archaeology,
Mm-hmm.
is he wanted to find the site of Homer, like the from the Iliad and the Odyssey. He wanted to find Troy.
Right.
And so he was working his way through classical texts, trying to figure out the location of Troy, and then went and did excavations and blew up a bunch of different sites to try to get to Troy.
Wow.
So the point being that even then, like you would want to do some kind of historical research. Now, the way that archaeologists and people that are legitimately scientists trying to do this would do it is again, historical research is often a first step. Other times people, come across things all of the time, varies by place. But for example, in Europe, in Italy, um, I remember my friends used to say when we dug there, in your backyard you find Roman artifacts. So like
Wow.
you can see by concentration of artifacts of things people found, have reported where there might be sites. And so I mentioned already historical documentation, citizen reporting, any type of like reporting of things being found. And then, of course, archaeologists do now a lot of surveying. They use a lot of remote sensing, like satellite images to detect anomalies. For example,
LiDAR, right?
yeah, LiDAR is one
Uh-huh.
that they use actually in the rainforest because LiDAR can detect structures under the tree canopy
Right.
and can actually get you the topography of a place. So LiDAR is used, we use any method possible and at our disposal from across the disciplines, from remote sensing to historical analysis to using citizen scientists to doing survey ourselves and actually like walking the distance of multiple kilometers and looking for things to try to have a best guess and then dig as a very last resort.
I see.
Digging is expensive and it's a final resort because it destroys everything that you dig. So
Right.
that is it for that record. You better do a good job of documenting.
And I was gonna say, if you're an amateur, there's a high chance of you destroying whatever. If you have a hot lead or something's down here, there's a good chance you're gonna at least damage it.
Oh, absolutely. And it's not just about damaging the actual thing, right? So let's say you find whatever that thing is. It's not about digging that out carefully, although that's also very important. But the soil around it, where it was compared to other things, where it was it found upside down? Was it in a certain
Mhm.
position? There are certain residues around it. Even touching it with your bare hands could contaminate it. You work at, a certain lab. And so, am I allowed to say that?
Yeah.
Let me give
Yeah,
it.
of course.
So like at Lawrence Livermore, they do a lot of radiocarbon testing.
Right.
And we use all of that context that I just described to figure out whether something was disturbed, was it placed correctly in that place? So everything that surrounds that artifact, that find itself is important.
Mm-hmm.
It tells us a bit of that story of how it came to be there, what it was there. And then, like I mentioned, like the soil around it, even if you imagine a lot of organic material doesn't survive, like some material that are more hardy, they survive through time, but not a lot of things don't, but they leave chemical residues. So we have
I see.
the tools to be able to figure out like what was a clay pot used for, and we have been able to figure out. We do a chemical analysis on those residues. So you might damage the thing, you damage the story of the thing too.
And I imagine the dirt is kind of like rings on a tree. You're peeling away one layer at a time to see these ages upon ages of dirt just laying over it.
Frustratingly so. And so I'll share some pictures with you of the site where I worked for my dissertation and the actual place that I dug. And these layers can be so complex, and
Yeah.
each one tells so much of a story. You can be as detailed and as granular as if you were like digging with a fine toothed comb, and you'll still find more and more to do. So the
Wow.
frustrating thing about archaeology is that there's so much to do, so little time to do it, and always so much to do still.
Okay. Let's get into the heart of the matter. Now, if I
Okay.
had some aluminum foil, I'd pop it on right now because that's where we're headed. Like I mean, just like armchair history fanatics, like most, the first thing I think of when I think of ancient history is Egypt and the pyramids, and things of that sort. Um, and going back to kind of like when you and I used to watch Indiana Jones in Raiders of the Lost Ark, the staff of Ra or the headpiece for it was in there, but like I was totally bummed out when I found out it wasn't real. Um, but I say that to say, or I say that to ask, why is there so much controversy around Egypt? Why is it such a enigma wrapped in a riddle?
So Egypt has always been fascinating to the outside world in terms of the history and the archaeology. I think the history of archaeology in Egypt goes back 200 to 300 years, somewhere around 250 years. So that history of outsiders going into Egypt doing archaeology is that long. So you
Wow.
might imagine how long our fascination with it has been. They have obviously very visible physical remains.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want to go back even further in Western civilization, like even the ancient Greeks were fascinated with the Egyptian civilization, like Herodotus writes about them. It's always been a fascinating culture. It's been in contact with a lot of sort of these bases and classics of Western civilization, the history of Roman Empire and Cleopatra.
Mm.
So it's always held a special place, I think, in the Western imagination in general.
Elizabeth Taylor, right? That
Mhm.
Cleopatra.
That one exactly.
Sorry, I didn't mean to knock you off course. Go ahead.
No, that's actually great. Um, so so the fascination's always been there on the one hand. On the other hand, I think because it's sort of been this element of otherworldly fascination, this interest in it, it creates a few things. One, it creates a bunch of grifters because there's always this public interest in something, and that creates the opportunity for you to be able to grift and make a quick buck, whether that's
Mm,
people selling fake mummy artifacts or even
wow.
like making whatever claims for clicks and as clickbait.
Okay. Wow.
So then the other part is the story of like Egypt, as I was saying, has been told by outsiders for the most part. I mean, up until very recently. So um in the 1800s, when people like Flinders Petrie went and started excavating in Egypt, their policy was that they would excavate and take out they had this tier policy for where they would take the finds. all of the best finds would always go to the British Museum. And then
Mm,
well, the less impressive ones, but still very impressive, would go to their personal collections and museums. So there's like
whoa.
massive Petrie Museum in England, if
Right.
anyone's there to visit, that has some incredible finds from Egypt. And then sort of like after that tier, like Egypt would get to keep those artifacts. Now I'm mentioning this as a way of saying that like the story, the history of those periods has been mostly written in the Western world and talked about in the Western world by outsiders. So has some things been have some things been lost in translation? I would say so. Has it also again created opportunity for our imagination to run wild with some things? Again, I would say so.
Yeah.
But then there's also with archaeology, and it's not just Egypt, everywhere else, because there's so many unanswered questions and so many possibilities, you you also have this opportunity, like people's imagination, you can come up with different ways of coming up with a story. So
Right.
so many different things.
Yeah, when you said it invites or attracts grifters, it reminded me of this thing, Art Bell. I'm a huge Art Bell fan, as you probably know. And he would go and maybe twice a year, or not twice a year, every couple of years he would go, and he would say that if you take that iconic picture of the pyramids and then just turn the frame the other direction, there's a Hilton right behind it. And I mean, it's a business
Mhm.
like any other at this point, right? Yeah, and it's just crazy that I didn't even realize. Well, I'm sure it happens, or I'm sure I should have known, but I didn't even realize that people are going to try to fake evidence to sell, just like any other field. Like that must be rampant, especially in like the most famous archaeological art. Yeah,
Yeah.
whatever.
So
Archaeological
it's
site.
for your one of your future rabbit holes. I suggest looking into the Hobby Lobby ancient Sumerian clay tablets. Um,
No way.
so they contain some illegally obtained clay somehow within it. It's so yeah,
Whoa.
antiquities trade, illegal and legal, is so fishy.
Hmm.
Always like connected to the criminal element. Um, Publicly known to be funding terrorist organizations. Like ISIS, one of the
Wow.
things that they did in the Middle East was they loot the sites and then sell the artifacts on the black
Yeah.
market, fund whatever it was that they were doing. So um, definitely a massive business connected to some of the most like everyday corporations, people you might not even imagine.
Yeah, I bet. I want to stay on the Egypt thing. I sent you a link a couple of days ago. It's channeled the channel Bright Insight. It's one of my favorite channels to watch to feed this need I have for
I
there
don't
to
know
be
what I did in a past life.
um,
Okay.
to feed this, need I have for there to be some um not paranormal, but something extraordinary behind it all, right? So um, he makes claims on that channel that the pyramids and the surrounding structures are more like 10,000. He and others, I may say, are more like 10 around 10,000 BC, from around 10,000 BC. And if I'm not mistaken, the official narrative is that it's around 3200 BC. Why is there such a giant discrepancy? It seems like, I mean, you have these giant structures. There's got to be a way to pinpoint it, right? Or no? Am I wrong?
There is, and we have. I think that's the thing. So, what I neglected to mention in my answer, and I think what you touched on, is this like fascination and wanting to fascination with the extraordinary, whether it's like the extraterrestrial extraordinary or like the fantastical or like something beyond that mundane of the everyday and that that history. The thing is, the history of it, the actual archaeology is not mundane and it's really super interesting. I will say that archaeologists don't do a great job of communicating to the public.
Yeah.
Even like communicating to the future generation of archaeologists. Little known fact about me, I have a PhD in archaeology, but I failed the very first archaeology I ever took in college and only took it again just so I could improve my GPA. I hated the way it was being taught. It was like literally the entire class was just going through different, like slightly different decorations of ceramics through hundreds of years. And it was like these statistical tables basically tracking these slightly minute changes in ceramic styles.
Right.
It was horrible. And then I myself, another little known fact, and I dug this out. I'll send you pictures of it later. Okay. So this when after we visited Persepolis when we were little, I went back to a bookstore in Iran, and this is a book by
No way.
Eric von Daniken. He's like
Now
the
we're
OG
talking.
conspiracy theorist.
Now we're talking.
Period of the Gods, I think, was his main work.
Chariot of
And
the
so
Gods is
I
like
started reading that. I mean, I was 8.
quadruple platinum.
And then exactly. And this book, I think of his is called Hashtomi Ajube Jahan in Farsi, but Eighth Wonder of the World.
Uh-huh.
And it has like chapter titles like The Gods Visit to Colombia, their strategy. Like, you know? So look, I mean, it's interesting, it's fascinating, it's like reading sci-fi. It sucks you in and you want to learn more because they do a good job of weaving these stories from like sprinkling a little bit of truth and then like stretching that a little bit and bringing in something from somewhere else and
Uh-huh.
basically relying on you not to have done the research, because who has done the research of like the entire history of the world? Like, a regular
Right.
person will not have that context. So all that to say, we have done it. We don't do a great job of communicating it. But like, so one example, and I have some video links for you, so you can include those in like if you want play bits of them.
I love it.
It's so a few things. One is the ancient Egyptians, and when I say ancient Egyptians, this is something that I hate because if you think about Egyptian history, it goes from 5000 BC, what we think of ancient Egypt, all the way to like after Christ. So
Okay.
it's 5 millennia of time. You've seen, I'm sure, that is it a tweet or something that's like Cleopatra is closer to the invention of the iPhone than she was to the time of the Great Pyramids of Giza.
That's insane. Yes, I have seen that. It's insane.
So it's not just like this monolith of a culture, right? It's like it went through so many changes, so many versions of it. And but one thing that lasted, I think, for a very long period of their history is that they documented all of the things in hieroglyphs. They literally have pictures that they have painted of the entire process of quarrying the stones, of how they cut them and how they carry them, and the mechanics of like how they're done and the boats that they go on top of that, like as we found like actual camps of the workers that have built the pyramids. So like we get that time period completely calibrated and you see the camps of the workers, what they ate, what they did. We find their toolkits. And then of course we have actual archaeological evidence, right? So you mentioned around 5,000 years ago, 3200 BC is sort of that official record. It's when we start to see some pyramids being formed, these structures. And one interesting thing that we see is within one generation, you see the trial and error of the Egyptians. So like of how a pyramid is built. Like you have 3 different pyramids, the attempts at building a pyramid within one pharaoh's lifetime. The first one crumbles within that pharaoh, like within 30 years of being built. And you can see the core of it. And it allows us to track like what engineering failures led to it, what masonry issues led to it.
Wow.
Then you see within that same lifetime and the next one, and this is called, I think I want to say the Leaning Pyramid. I have to look this up, but there is like a wonky pyramid. That's sort of the second attempt at creating it. And then that one is leaning, and then you have the final one that's actually like you can see the corrections, the improvements that they made in the
Hmm.
process. It's very, very human.
A lot
And
of terminated architects.
Terminator architects indeed. And then I like, just to say, I think a lot of it, one thing I was saying earlier was the history is written by outsiders. And some of it was like people going out there and going, really? Like these Egyptians built these pyramids like back then? They really did. And they really did. I think like
Underestimating them, right? Yeah, yeah.
yeah, that's sort of disbelief. And you see that, I know we're going to talk about this, but you see that elsewhere, like in Central America too, the same type of thing. Like
Hmm.
these archaeologists will go out and be working with Maya workmen and be like, really, like these are these pyramids, these are, and would basically allow that bias and that racist undertone to say, okay, like I really don't think this is that.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so even some of the people that are making money out of selling these stories, like there's people that sell tours to like the Inca tours and like
Yeah.
some other places. They will flat out say like the reason I discovered this was because I just couldn't believe like the ancient Inca could build something like this. And it's like
Wow.
people have always been incredibly smart, and we've probably lost so much more knowledge than we'll ever know. Like,
And as Assyrians who tout our knowledge base from the past, like we should be more familiar with that fact. Now you mentioned that like you did work in Belize.
mhm.
Do those structures, I know there's pyramids in Central America as well. Do those structures have the same kind of controversy?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And it's a little bit of that same type of controversy of like who really built these structures, and then there's the familiarity of that pyramid shape with the Egyptian pyramids, like how
Hmm.
could they exist? And then there's the Mesopotamian ziggurat structure. And so there's that type, but with the Mesoamerican or Central American stuff and the Maya stuff specifically in Belize where I worked, is that there was always a confusion of Maya and Aztec, and sort of this blending of all of these sort of South America and Central American ancient cultures into this one monolith.
Right, right,
So,
right.
for example, Apocalypto, if you remember Mel's
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
masterpiece.
Yeah, yeah, I remember that movie.
um, and so that was
It's
supposed to depict,
gory.
the Maya apocalypse essentially of the Spaniards arriving in the Maya homelands.
Right.
But I mean, first of all, they were like just flat out factual and like historical mistakes. But then most of the things that they were showcasing, from the outfits to the rituals, were Aztec,
Hmm.
and that is stretch. But so like there's that sort of general population confusion that's fueled, I think, mainly by in some, I think, instances, misinformation, and then it's willful or it's accidental, but in any case it's misinformation.
Now, I maybe I should have told you this before I asked you all the pyramid questions, but I'm having all your answers fact checked by History Channel's ancient astronaut theorists. So you are screwed, my friend.
I know,
I'm
I'll
not saying
just
it was aliens, but it was aliens. um so the as far as your work as your brother, the one I remember the most, your research, and is the dig at Çatalhöyük. Tell
Mhm.
me a little bit about like your work there.
Right. So I worked at Çatalhöyük for about 10 years almost. I did my dissertation research there. I started out there as a master's student. I went out there as actually a part of a digital heritage team. And so the goal of that team was, again, to use technology to make
Mhm.
these sort of archaeological sites, experiences accessible to the general public through immersive stuff. So I started like doing that, mainly doing and working that project. And then I became interested in the site. It is an incredibly interesting site, complex, known worldwide. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site listed. And so
And
Um,
UNESCO is basically UN for educational stuff, right?
UN for global heritage, tangible and intangible.
I see.
So yeah, and so every country, every organization has an opportunity to submit. It's a long and arduous process, and you go through and try to sort of say why something is of global value in terms of heritage. And
I see.
so I think in 2012, while I was there, they got this listing officially approved. And the reason why it was so important overall to the world and
Mm-hmm.
just to me, it was interesting was because it was a very large site, a very ancient site. And by large, I mean something like 35 hectares, or I'm sorry, 35 acres. So it was quite a large village, 9,000 years old. Thousands of people lived and like cohabited in this village. No central authority or hierarchy. Relatively complex architecture. So you imagine it's a large site. It's a tell site, or what archaeologists call a tell site or a hillside. So these sites essentially started out as a spread of houses. Then, as those houses go out of use, the next set of houses are built on top of them. Same
Mm.
thing over and over again. And there's like over 1,000 years of continuity of doing this. So imagine a millennia of people living on top of like the previous houses. And so you have this tell forms that's, I want to say 25 meters deep. 1,000 years of continuity. We have like, think of a modern city that's been continuously inhabited for 1,000 years, and there's not that many. So that just gives you a sense of scale, like
Wow.
of continuously house after house, generation after generation, staying in the same place. And so they had complex habits, trade networks that extended hundreds, if not thousands of miles. So we knew like they were bringing in obsidian from certain places. They were bringing other resources from other places. Like we could chemically check the source against these places and know where they came from. They also had really complex rituals, implication of art, even, everything from incredible artworks that they had done on the interior of their houses, depicting hunting scenes, depicting geometric art like squares and other stuff. So I'll share pictures for you to add here for reference so that
Definitely.
folks can have a better idea. But so you have this 9,000-year-old site. It's massive. It's continuously occupied. It has evidence of art. It's super complex. And it's first discovered in the 60s. And at the time, everyone thought that Mesopotamia was this cradle for some of these earliest civilizations. And so to have something outside of that area and so ancient was big. Of course, now there's like even more ancient sites all over throughout Mesopotamia, throughout sort of like that entirety of Southwest Asia.
Mm-hmm.
So we now know that there is that sort of longer duration of human occupation, etc. But at the time, this was super shocking.
Wow. And my next couple of questions, I'm gonna make them into one. Did you find any controversial stuff, anything that you guys were um, not agreeing with each other as a group of researchers, as you know, it was like about like where the source is, that's something that you found and you're like, this guy's out of his mind, or this person is out of his or her mind, anything like that.
So a lot of disagreements, all of the time disagreements, but nothing controversial, nothing like, oh, I think this is like a cover up of some sort.
No
Um,
flying saucers, so.
the things that we see, if ever a cover up or we hear of, I haven't seen this firsthand, is like if
Mm.
you're digging somewhere where land is being contested and you find a certain type of cultural find, they'll tell you hide it so that there is no history of this other culture being. So that
Whoa.
type of political stuff I've
Whoa.
heard like firsthand accounts of,
Mm-hmm.
but not like the type of hide the aliens type of stuff or hide the ancient civilization. I assure you, if anyone was to find some like advanced civilization dating back to that time, they would be screaming it from the tops of mountains.
Right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Definitely. I know I would.
So, but let me tell you, like, just for context, what some of the like the disagreements that I say are about. And I tell
Okay.
you, these are like these super posh, usually like soft-spoken academics, having probably yelled at anyone in their life, but they would come to fist fights, like near fist fights. My advisor like would like hit his hand on the table like one time I saw him yelling at each other. And it
Wow.
was mostly about the interpretation of the stuff. So like
Okay.
someone would present their data and then they would say, and based on this data, I believe X, Y, and Z about the society. So
Mhm.
like I believe like that this house belonged to a nuclear family because it was a certain size and it makes sense for it, like for this many people to live there and like the storage that they had, whatever. And then, the other person would say, oh no, but you're not thinking about the rest of the site. And there's like this other big storage and this big blah, 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 blah. So it's all about like these minutia of data and your interpretation of them. And it's taken very, very personally for people. So
Yeah, yeah. But I imagine like that drives it forward in a way, right? Other barring personal attacks, that kind of disagreement drives it forward and it allows you to think about different ways of looking at a situation, right?
yeah, I mean, of course. And that's when it's productive, it's especially productive because you have to first be diligent in what you're reporting. So be diligent in what you're collecting, be able to defend your position. So it has to be logically sound and you have to have evidence for what you're arguing. And with archaeology, I think there's a misconception that we find one thing and we make up these like big stories about it. And sometimes that's true with some archaeologists that might not be very good at their job, but one thing that we do is like
Shots fired.
imagine like a forensic detective, the subs. So like a forensic scientist, like bones, I think that's
Uh-huh.
a kind of a good way of putting it, of finding different clues and details that will inform this one thing so that if you have to guess, you're at least kind of sure.
So you're kind of uh you're a weird one because I mean, you're in archaeology and all that things, but you're also currently like, or you did stuff with UX research. So you're you're looking at the past, deep, 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 far past, and then now you're doing stuff that's on the cutting edge, and you're using current technology to gain knowledge on people that are alive, live humans. So that how is that different? Tell me a little bit about UX research. I don't. I'm not even quite sure I know what it is. So just tell me what it is first.
So UX research stands for user experience research, and it's something that a lot of anthropology students or psychology students, a lot of the social sciences and human sciences, when they go into
Mm,
the industry, this is an area where they go into because they have that social research aspect of experience. But essentially, what it is that in whatever company, product, business area that you're working in, you look essentially at the end user that the service or product is made for, and you are their voice, you advocate for them, and you help build products that and services that are useful for them. And so you help companies make things that people actually need. If I was to simplify it. You brought up a very interesting point of like you now get to talk to living people, and I think that's one of the biggest differences is I get to just ask my research subjects, how do you feel about a certain thing? What would
right.
be helpful to you on, within this context? And what's not helpful to you when you're using this feature? What is this about this feature that makes your life better? So I can still ask those questions, but I will still say like data is always incomplete in some ways, and that you will be able to get some parts of the picture but never the whole picture. So in that way it's still kind of similar to archaeology in that you're supposed to, for example, understand how people feel about eyewear and improve their experience and how they get eyewear, what eye health means to them, etc. And how do you get that from a survey? So you have to think hard about the types of questions that you're asking, or how do you get at that from an interview? So
Mm.
it's still a lot of that creative thinking of, I have a question that I want to ask. I can't ask it directly. I can't get that feedback directly. How do I do it?
Yeah, you touched on my next question, which is how your experience as an anthropologist translates over. So is there something that's in its infancy or maybe not yet ready to come out, but on its way out? Is there a piece of technology that you think would help? I mean, LiDAR is one of those things. I think they found some new stuff in the Amazon. So is there something that's on the way out that can just you said digging is last resort. So
Mhm.
will digging ever become completely abandoned?
I don't think so. I think there's it's going to decrease, especially because one issue that we're coming up against in archaeology is that there have been so many digs. And so if you imagine you go out and dig for 3 months, you now have enough material to actually like do research and publish for years.
Mm-hmm.
And oftentimes you have digs that will go on for years and years and years, but the proportion of what they publish from those digs is very small. So you have a bunch of stuff that's been dug out, documented, but not necessarily shared with the broader world. So a lot of people are turning to doing archival research where they go in, use those records, and like still study those materials. But there's something to be said. And it's not just about going out to dig. One interesting thing, like in the glaciers up north, as they are melting, there's a lot of emergency archaeology being done.
Oh yeah, I heard about
There's
that.
this resource with you too. So they're finding like as the glaciers are melting, these sites are just appearing, these incredible artifacts, like actual wooden arrow, fully preserved from like, from in the Arctic, intricate designs of textiles and things like that. Super cool.
Wow.
So as our world is changing, like there's always gonna stuff is gonna come up. Development is one thing that really drives archaeology too, because I think most places have regulation. If you want to develop new roads, new housing, etc., it has to go through like archaeologists as well.
Well, this was going to be my last question, but I thought of another question, so I'll make this second to last. Do you see
So
yourself going back out to another dig? Is that in the cards for you in the future?
probably
Really?
not too fast. As a volunteer, yeah, I mean,
Oh, that's
so you
exciting.
might imagine I spent most of my career doing that. And so I have a pretty deep network of people that as they're maturing in their career, they're starting to head research and digs and things like that. And so if I have the time from work, I'll definitely be able to do it.
No, I'm going to say this as carefully as possible because you're my older sister and can beat me up. But does this make you a senior statesman in the archaeological world?
I'm getting there. I still do keep up with my like research score, but it's super petty, but I do, and I should because I haven't contributed to like publishing since 2018 actively, but it is I am hoping to become a senior statesman.
But well, as your brother who always looks for updates from you regarding this, because other than like I said, my favorite ancient astronaut theorists on the History Channel, you're my ultimate source for this kind of stuff. Here's my last question for you. Have you ever, not in a tongue-in-cheek way, have you ever said this belongs in a museum? Just to wrap back around
All the
to
time.
Indiana
All
Jones.
the time. Oh my God. It was big all of the
That makes
time.
me so happy.
All of the time. We used to clown it all of the time. But I will say, I don't know if this was part of your questions list. I remember thinking about it while I was watching the latest Indiana Jones. We knock it a lot, and there's a lot that's wrong with it. The one scene where he's teaching to that bored out of their mind class, and no one has done the reading, and he's like, "Has anyone done the reading?" The awkward silence. I know every archaeology professor has felt that at some point in time.
Oh man, that's hilarious. And I'm sorry, I was hoping you wouldn't mention that, but like I made you watch the movie so we could talk about it. But it I
I
watched
watched
it
it
too,
all
but we didn't
early.
really touch on it. So I'm glad you brought it back around to the movie.
We do a part two in the future. I
We
remember as
have
I was
to.
watching, I was taking a mental list of like, this is actually kind of true. And this is absolutely like BS. But yeah,
Yeah, that's
a lot of thoughts
crazy.
and feelings.
The fact that you can say things like this belongs in a museum, especially if you had said it in a moment of anger, that would make my life.
You say a lot of out-of-pocket stuff as an archaeologist. That's one thing we used to like. So you do a lot of stuff that's macabre, like super macabre. At Chatal, one of the things I didn't talk about was their burial practices. So they buried there was some so they buried their dead under their houses essentially. And as they lived in the house and more people died, they would dig up the same grave, like push the bones to the side and add in like and deposit the new person. So a lot of the graves would have like some of them 30, 40 people would be in there. They would keep like
Wow.
opening them back up, putting them. You can tell the bones would be taken out at various times, probably like rebound and like put back in. So really
Wow.
different burial practices, really interesting, really,
Mm.
really complex. And one of the things that they did was they buried infants like at the foundation of the houses. You often found infant burials right before, like as the walls are about to be built for the houses. And so there was argument like, is this a sacrifice? Is this not? But like, on a day-to-day basis, we'd be like, oh, what are you doing? I'm just sieving infant bones from like I'm picking out infant bones from this pile of dirt. So lots of out of pocket stuff that you get to say on a day-to-day basis that you don't really think about until later on when you're talking to someone who's not doing that. They're like,
So
what did you say?
yeah, Indiana Jones took it easy on us then.
Definitely. I think it can get a lot worse.
That's hilarious. That's awesome. Well, thank you so much. I have to say, I think you set the bar really high for any future guest. You've shamefaced me. I tried my best to not include any of our inside jokes to make things, relatable. So maybe next time we'll get more into it and get more into the nitty gritty of all this stuff. So I appreciate your
Sounds
time.
good.
Thank you so much again. This was our first episode to this untitled podcast, which is going to be a global phenomenon. Mark my words.
I love you. I can't wait.
I
Thank
love
you
you
for
too.
having me. I hope this has been fun for you. And thanks for listening to me rant about all of my rants.
And again, speaking of inside jokes, when you were talking about like vases or vase, I was gonna say you shot my vase. Thank God I hated
I
that
didn't
thing.
shoot Walter.
I'd rather you shot Walter. All right, there you go. That's what I wanted to end with.
Okay.
Thank you.
I love you, Patch.
I
Good
love you
night.
too. Good night.